Good morning. Let's be calm. So, my name is Michele Bustamante. I think I've already had an intro of sorts, so I'm just going to jump right in. This talk is about really about moving towards a message-based and/or event sourcing system. I tell this story based on my own sort of earned experiences in the last couple of years, because this is actually, only since we started doing microservice practice in our company, Alliance, I've been working with some of the smartest people in this industry who've been doing this for a really long time. So I like to bring in people that know way more than me when we go help customers, right? And so we've done a lot of Docker platform deployments. We've done a lot of different types of enterprise-level deployments. And there's a common theme across many of these enterprises, which is they struggle with certain visibility into the system and structured data and reports and dashboards and things like that. And so I think that that is what brings the passion for me in terms of moving forward with message file system, and I'll tell you that story in my way. So I called the new ESB as no ESB because apparently there is a hashtag #NoESB, and it's the one that all the people that produce ESBs complain about on Twitter because they want to say, well, yes, but you need all these things. So we're going to talk a little bit about the progression here. So everybody remember Hello World 1992, if you're, near my age, I guess. It looked something like this, right? We had this one big thing. We hit compile. We left for lunch. We came back. It still wasn't done, so we played Doom or Counter-Strike or whatever. And then eventually, we reached today, which is something like this for Hello World, right? So right out of the gate, we have a lot to think about. If you're coming out of school, I feel sorry for you. But the point is, we have a lot of moving parts, right? Every system has, front ends of different types. We've got mobile apps and web browsers and different style browsers and different Java libraries and then JavaScript libraries, and then we've got the back end, which is our APIs called from different paths, some of them for third-party consumption that we want to meter, and some of them for just our back end for SPA applications. And then, of course, we've got our back end, which usually revolves around APIs. And we got here after a long, progression since, say something around 2000-ish, where we had HTTP services and then SOAP services, and then now back to HTTP because it just seems to be simpler and fit the mobile model. So it's complicated. And, we're introducing microservices on top of all of that, which is fun, because, of course, that can be complicated as well, right? And so the question you might ask is, why would we bother to do that? And I think the answer is that there are business reasons. So microservices solve certain problems, right? It can help a business transform. That's a very high-level bullet point that sounds like a marketing pitch, though. And then we have the optimizing of platform choices because of Docker containerization, the ability to choose the language that fits the problem, the ability to have developers that are better at Golang than they are Node or C#, and let them choose the language that fits, but just build these things that we can, compose into one system. And then system resiliency, which is out of the gate something that's just necessary, right? Because we're going to have all these moving parts. So when we say microservice can help with this, it sounds a bit strange because microservice also introduces the need for it. So what does this all really mean? Well, only if it's done well, it will help you. So maybe there's that, right? And the way I like to look at it is this. You have these well-defined set of functionality that you want more control over. It needs to fit in your head. So you can do things like style messages and payloads and services and evolve that story and the schema and the storage and not worry that it impacts other areas of the system. So it should be contained. And it should align with a business domain so that the business can ask for features to evolve from that. Because that's the whole problem we have today, is that business tries to add features or ask for things, and we're afraid to hit publish on that code to production because the thing that they asked us to add also commingles with lots of other things across the solution, and we're just really not sure if our regression tests actually cover that full scenario. So this isolation gives us the ability to control that a little bit. And then, the idea would be that you build this system, this solution in microservices world so that you can deploy these updates and not impact other parts of the system. That would be nice, right? So this is the goal. And it's already complicated, right? So what we have today with our Hello World is already complicated. So what's the harm of adding a couple of more components, right? And the idea being that what we're trying to get to is this compartmentalization that matches a domain, that fits in your head, that you can somehow evolve separately and actually be successful with not only the features that are needed, but the deployment not touching other things, right? So now the business can say new features everywhere, and they can, of course, be in their own domain and ask for their features, and each of them, you know, separately updating without touching the rest of the system. That's the vision. Would you agree? Everybody must agree. Okay. Laughing is sort of a form of agreement, so I'm going to go with that. So there are some barriers. And some of those are cost, because it costs a lot to add the resources that are needed, and the training is needed, and the bodies that are needed to do this well and manage the complexity of it. And then the complexity itself is a barrier, because people aren't sure, can we be successful at this? And, you know, there's no simple answer to that. You know, this is complicated in some respects, but there are things that it simplifies in other respects. So then sometimes customers come up with this idea, why don't we just get the magical microservices platform that will let us put these services and put them into, you know, this sort of box that I don't have to really see all the things and manage all the things, because they're going to give me a clickety-click, pointy-point, do something, and the workflows are just going to happen, and I'm going to have full, you know, data. Oh, wait, no, they don't handle the data. Okay, we still have to deal with that. They're going to give us a business orchestration tool. You remember those, like BPEL, things like BizTalk Server. Again, there were times that made a lot of sense, EDI, transformations, and there are probably places where that's still really useful when you have legacy systems. But that doesn't mean it needs to be your hub and spoke around everything, right? So we need a business orchestration tool, and of course they're going to give us a monitoring and alerting management tool, and this is how they sell these products, right? Because it's just going to solve all your problems. Oh wait, but you still have to build your Docker containers and harden those and do all that. No, but we're solving all the other problems. What are those exactly? I'm not sure I remember. So, you know, let's just learn more tools is really what we're saying, right? Like, I'm going to have the magical platform that I have to learn, and now I'm locked into the vendor, and if I need to figure out what's going on inside the magical platform, I might struggle because I'm not really sure, right? So then I call them and they say, well, do you have a support contract? And if I pay for a support contract at the tune of $100,000 a year, then I'm probably going to get reasonable support. If I pay $200,000, I might get good support. And, you know, I'm sort of just saying that because I've never heard that before. And then there's the logs and audit that is promised, right? Because everything that happens inside the magical platform is actually going to be fully audited, and I'm going to have a history trail, and I'm going to be able to, you know, use that for business. Oh, wait, how do I do that? How do I use that with my business reports? Do I have to build those tools anyway? Yeah, I guess I do. Well, that's okay. It solves all the other problems inside the box, so we're okay. And so now we've got the other problem of aggregation and system logs. Where do those go? In the magical platform? Probably not. I've got my Amazon and my Azure and my logs from VMs and my logs from containers, and I've got my logs that I output from my app and failures and exceptions. And all of those things still have to go somewhere, but they're not going here because this is a closed platform. So I guess I have to get the stuff out of this platform and put it over here. But they're solving all the other problems inside, so it's really still a good thing. Okay, so I've probably made a point. You may or may not agree with it, and that's okay too. Let's continue. Why don't we just go lighter weight and get an ESB? Because all that does is connect messages back and forth between the parts of the system. And what it gives me is, well, are there uses for ESBs still today? Are there reasons ESBs existed in the past? And the answer would be, in the past, for sure, yes. But what happened is they started out with just monitoring of messages and giving you connectivity and transformation between, say, SOAP and some other protocol, and giving you a way to manage that, because in a large organization, maybe a TIBCO or something like that made sense, especially with the EDI transformation. So that was the real reason we started with it. And then they added things like security to those endpoints, which, of course, we never need to know anything about the user or the original login or token at the services that we build, right? So, of course, they could just do it all for us. Not really, though, right? So, there was reasons that was useful back then before we had evolved to now, and maybe a little less reason to use it today. The things that were the promise were protocol and message transformation. So I've used things like Mercury and BizStock, and there's others like them. Message augmentation. Message comes in, I go get some additional data, I pack on some new stuff, and then I send that message to the downstream service. Because I couldn't write that code, and I wouldn't want that to be in a microservice that I could manage myself and actually understand what it does, right? So that wouldn't be any good. That might be sarcasm. Sorry, just pointing that out. Workflow of choreography of services. So workflow can be useful. We do have a problem if we don't have the ability to understand where things are in the system. That's one of the #1 reasons that we think about a message architecture, right? Message-based streaming or event sourcing gives me a way to know stuff that happened all over the place. In the whole solution, though, not just a single microservice. So the thing is, how can another tool give me a way to truly choreograph based on that? What will I have to put into the tool to get value out? And that comes back to the business tooling that we would need anyways, that we're going to have to build anyways, so we can choose to build it into a platform that now owns my middle tier and adds overhead, or we can choose to build it outside of that, out of band, async, because I think async is a popular word these days, just thinking out loud. And then there's the security aspects, which I would say, maybe because I'm tainted and I do a lot of security work, it's not really that hard to validate tokens and boundaries at services these days. There's lots of middleware that does this for you, or API gateways, which don't add extra overhead to processing inside and stuff that we can't see. And then audit and logs, I would argue, gosh, there's an awful lot of tools for that too. And wouldn't I rather everything go to one audit and log storage that I can see everything and build fantastic, not magical dashboards that I put work into, but because I put work in, I get stuff out that actually fits my business. I don't think that these platforms for a very large organization will solve all of the problems, because there's too much complexity, and my fear is always lock-in, and I don't have the flexibility to control. Make sense? Yes. I see the yeses, and that's also good for me. So what's missing is things like then that integration of audit logs with other things in the system outside of the USB. And audit is special. That's not the same as a history of things that happened in terms of exception throwing and debug logs and so on. This is a particular thing that we do when we access a service and access is denied, for example, and that's an audit point. Any illegitimate access to a service should be recorded, and every time you let's say change a user's privileges, permissions, or so on, those are auditable points. And then there's an awful lot of other things that could be auditable points, like access to PII content and so on. And so that list goes on with your compliance and regulation, and that should actually not go in these async logs that we normally do. It should go into a place that we will fail if we can't write it. Somebody tries to access a service, and it's successful or fails, then if I can't write the audit log, the whole call should fail, and the consumer of that should just not get what they came for, even if it was successful. Because if I can't write the audit, my system won't have the integrity it's supposed to have around audit. Make sense? That's audit. Separately, we've got logging. Logging can be a bit lossy. Not too lossy, of course. We want to keep an eye on that. But you can do things like get file beat on your Docker containers, file beat on your VMs, ship those logs up to Elasticsearch. That's a very common, popular tool. There are other ways to do it, right? But that's a very common, popular tool. The point is, we want to have a baseline, something we can invest in, that we can kind of use for lots of stuff, because this is time-consuming. And we're investing in learning how to build dashboards and have visibility. And so things like messages are one thing, things like logs from my system and diagnostics are another, and then audit is another. We've got at least those three categories. And sometimes we want to see all of them together. So we still want to have an audit. The messages happened, and then we might want to treat messages with some extra special care too. That's a mouthful. Okay. History tables. How many people write history tables? Only a few. Okay. Well, you will one day, and then you'll say, hey, I remember that conversation. So, I can't tell you how many times from years and years past, and I've actually been guilty of prior to, you know, message-based and event sourcing popularity, recommending that we make a history table for things. Like every time you update a user, go create a DocDB or a NoSQL and record that thing, because we need to know what happened. I've had customers have trouble where they can't figure out what happened to a user record or a student record in their system, teachers, students, that kind of user, and that's because they have no history, zero history. And then they start creating the history, but it only starts now. It doesn't go backward, so I don't really have my full picture, do I? Because every time I edit a record, I'm only editing the current state. You get that kind of for free if you do messaging. Of course, the not free part is the stuff you do to go work on building a messaging system. But the rest is free. That's a good thing. Free is good. The other things weren't free at all, so there's that. And then we've got the operational tools, which I've already mentioned. So this is sort of what's missing when we think about working with just an ESB or a magical tool in the middle. And I think at the end of the day, I'm pretty sold on designing microservices with the idea you may actually want to go with a message-based system. Not everybody should. You also don't have to go all in. There are ways to do a partial step on that for the big impact items in your business, right? So it's obviously going to depend. I know, that's what everybody says. So let's talk about design. When I think about a microservice architecture, I'm probably going to have, you know, these buckets of things. Well, if I'm a product online that sells software or sells something in a shopping cart, I'm going to have customers, I'm going to have products, a catalog. That's going to grow and evolve over time separately from the shopping cart, which is the interactive, you know, thing that customers actually use when they're online. They're going to place orders from that. That's a separate thing, because that's after I've already gone to the shopping cart. We've got fulfillment, which is how do I ship that stuff to you, and the list goes on. And identity management, I put at the bottom here, is really just one example of a domain. So if I was going to the whiteboard with a customer about their business, I'd probably come up with a bunch of these types of high-level buckets. And then those would be the things that I have to open up and see how many microservices fit inside there. What do I see, right? And there's some finessing to that, but let's continue. So with identity management, I might find 4 buckets. Entitlements might not be as common, but for sure I've got the concept of the sign-on part, runtime user login. That's got to perform. It's a runtime service. And it's got to be current in terms of like the user's credentials, their state, are they active, inactive, locked out or not, that kind of thing. And then I'm going to have user management, some way to create users, register users, invite users, some way to have that user data be updated, and of course, the new users have to somehow get over to the single sign-on service. But these could be considered separate things. And then permissions, of course, is separate, but people commingle that often with an identity service, mostly because we have this concept of claims, and we've been sort of brainwashed, hey, put a role in the claim, and now we can authorize. And I think for small systems, that's kind of good enough. But for most systems, we have the need for more granular set of permissions, and we need to manage that. So that's what we would end up doing here. Make sense? So I now have 3 or potentially 4 if I go to entitlements, which is which students do you have access as a teacher? That's really just relations, right? You know, it's access to things in my system. But some people like to centralize that so they can audit that as a thing. And so when they go into the, you know, I guess, mindset of entitlements being this centralized thing for their whole ecosystem of apps, then they will invest in that. But not everybody needs to do that. Sometimes you just look up, do I have the rights to that user? And you look for patterns so you can replay that through the app. So I now have potentially 3 or 4 microservices in domains inside this. And you know, I came up with that, but think about your domains and how many things might pop up. When I go to the whiteboard, there is no step-by-step guide on how do you break down your domain. It's a domain-driven design philosophy where you think about and finesse about and reason about what is the type of data and use cases and workflows that the business does around this, and where am I finding the lines between them? So I might start with the big picture, drill down, and then realize, wait a minute, these are related. I think maybe there is a bit more to this microservice. These things should go together. And you'll figure that out as you go, unfortunately with no particular guide, just thinking and reasoning. And hey, the worst thing that could happen is You get it wrong, but nobody else knows that, because at least you have these separate silos that you can manage that fit in your head. So we've got a step ahead already, right? There's lots of wrong ways to do everything. So yeah, as long as it's heading in the right direction, you're still going to be successful. So when you think about microservices, it's not necessarily one service, one endpoint. It is potentially multiple services that are co-located, that is the microservice, because the meaning of the microservice is that I deploy that as a unit. It shares schema, it has dependencies across the things. But if I'm CQRS, I automatically have two services, right? A write and a read that is, bucketed into sharing potentially the same data store unless I separate those, right? So there's dependencies between them, therefore they roll out together, therefore there are multiple services in a microservice. Hopefully that makes sense. So taking an example of identity, because it's something that crosses over, everything we do, and hopefully it makes sense. Just thinking about, I might start out with a single permission service. That looks like a domain to me. That's probably a single microservice, and I've got admin or system permissions that are sort of the starting point of the system, and then I've got these tenants that create apps, and they're going to take on, maybe by default, the system permissions over here, and then maybe they're allowed to modify that and say, hey, I don't want an admin to have all these permissions. I'm going to uncheck a couple things. So, you've got this concept of tenancy, right? And then you've got the runtime, which is I go to an app, I've logged in, the user goes and looks up their permissions, or the runtime does, the middleware, and it needs a way to find out, based on this tenant and that user, do a lookup, what are you allowed to do? So you could argue that then this runtime API has to co-locate with this data and all of these together. That's one view. And then I can start, thinking in terms of, well, how about if I made it an optimized read-only cache for permission lookup, and now I've actually done an eventually consistent, copy, if you will, of whatever is the user's permissions, and that eventually consistent result is my highly performant read optimized path, which I could now think about isolating from the rest as a separate service, because now I don't have the dependency between the two, right? I could evolve this, and the question is this affected? That's what you have to think about when you think about the bucket of the microservice, right? Can I evolve them separately? Can I build version tolerance into the schemas? If this is NoSQL, and I now added some new features here, is it okay that there's extra data now that maybe this service doesn't know about yet, or that the consumer of the service doesn't know about yet? Potentially, right? Again, it all comes down to how you think about it, but as long as you're, making sure you can do this deployment and not break everybody, that's the goal, right? So that's one way to reason about permissions. When we think about microservices for then like breaking it down fully, I would have admin tools using this microservice, creating system permissions, which would eventually become consistent with the user's permissions that we create for tenants. And then this would eventually become consistent with our runtime cache, and I could potentially build these to be tolerant between each other so that they're actually separate microservices that can be independently deployed. And there's a whole process of versioning that we could go through, but I'm going to just keep going on the high-level design. What about just identity? We've got the concept of identity server, for example, for login. But if I'm doing the concept of CQRS, then I might think about reads and writes separately for optimization. And right now what I'm doing here is thinking, okay, for configuration, identity server needs the runtime service to get the read. And maybe initially I'm sharing that read with my management service that writes and creates configurations for the identity server, like which apps can log in and what the rules are. Which providers we support. Are we federating with, Office 365 or other things? And then over here, we've got our user runtime for login. We want that to be speedy, but maybe we start out sharing that. But we've broken the services into the read-write sort of model, the CQRS sort of model, and then eventually we can evolve this to break up the storage into separate, right, to have an eventually consistent optimized read for runtime. So again, another way to look at it, that would put me in the position where I actually have potentially 4 separate microservices once I break up the data, and right now I have 2 because it's sharing in the data in the schema. Okay, so all of this is leading up to messages and events and things that happen, right? And so now thinking about identity still, what are the things that might happen? Well, when I go to the identity server, I'm going to log in, log out, or maybe fail logging in, and after that get locked out. So these are activities, these are things that happen. In my management portal, I might create users and edit them, maybe delete a user. If I delete a user, how do I go back and find out what happened with that user last year or last month? Not going to work, right? But if I have messages and I have a history of all the things, then I can go back and see that that user was here, 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 and it was deleted on this day, right? That's a good thing. Not that I've seen that before, exactly that scenario with a customer in the past year. Of course I have. So in Management Portal, we got things like unlocking users, inviting users, which could generate an email. So there's activities that happen related to the user. And then maybe there's a profile or some sort of portal where the users self-register, right? They invite themselves, and then they get an email, then they confirm the email, and then they want to reset the password, and they get sent there to do the dance, right, with the email and the tokens and making sure. So all of these produce, again, events, right? So instead of just having services now and thinking about optimizing for reads, I can now think about how could I have a full history of all the things that happen with the user, which security, that would be a very important place to do such a thing. And how can I make that so that, you know, I still have my runtime data available for query and runtime activities, but I still have a log, if you will, that audit, that history to do something. And that's the idea that I'm basically getting to here. So that's my talk, just kidding. I'm going to go do demos now. So, you thought I was kidding? Wait, no, just kidding. Now I'm kidding twice. Okay, the jokes just get better, really, yeah. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is show you an example with Kafka. And so I've already given you the picture of the identity story. And what I have is a little example here that I'm actually just going to run it so I can show you what happens. So let me do that first, and then I'll explain all the moving parts. So I'm going to go to my Kafka directory here, and I've got a start Kafka command. So that's going to start Zookeeper locally, Kafka locally. I'm doing this for performance reasons just to get through this quickly. So you can. I also have a DCOS deployment that also has all of this on it. But I'm going to look at that in my talk later this afternoon. So we're running all of this locally, and I'm actually, again, going to be able to ship messages up through. So let's see. This is, oh, is that a problem? I hope not. Oh, no, it's not. It's fine. Hang on. Just checking. Do I have two? I do. I've got this guy. I've got this guy. That might not be so good. I'm going to do this. I'm going to shut that guy down. Let me just start that over again, if you don't mind. Because that looked a bit strange. I might have just hit the enter key or something and it stopped it. So I could tell that there was something a little off. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. I have a web app that's going to run. And when we take a look at it, you'll see what I can do with it. I'm going to generate some messages around creating a user and around you know, resetting the password and so on. So for now, I'm just going to forward through that. Actually, you know what? I think I want to run that without debugging first, so let's do that. Debug, start without debugging. Okay, and what we're going to see is I have a consumer somewhere here. We'll find the right one. I know we will. Which one are you going to be? Runtime consumer. That one. I might have two running there. I think I had one running already, so I might have just needed to restart that. Okay, it's like Groundhog Day, so I'm just going to do that all over again. Hang on a sec. Do I have anything running? Yes, no, maybe. Hang on. Okay, I think that should have done it, so I'm going to just do that one more time. I say one more, and as soon as you do that, you just really never know, so hopefully it's really one more. I've already done a Michele Busta, so I'm going to do Michele LaRue and Michele Busta at Gmail, and I'll call this Michele Busta 2. It's not going to really send me an email. It is a demo, okay? I know how to send email, people. So this is going to send a message, and I'll save my password. So all that did is basically send a message that should be picked up by this consumer. So I basically have a Kafka consumer that's looking on that topic of messages right now. And when that happens, I should be able to go to my DocDB over here, and I should be able to see in user management, because I'm using the remote DocDB instead of the local. Let's see, where is my... I want to, oop, don't do that, okay, yeah. So that's my collections, but I want to go to my Query Explorer. Okay, so I'm just going to do the run, and I see Michele Boost is there, and I should see, oh, I've got a lot of me. Where is the one that I just put, though? Very curious. Oh, no, that's my email. Sorry, I'm not even looking. Excuse me for a sec. I know I can find what I'm looking for. It is LaRue somewhere. Let's just do that again. And I don't know why I'm not seeing that. 1, 2, 3. Maybe it's taking time. We're going to see what's happening there. Hang on. Let's just go in here for a sec. Management. I see another record. Ah, there it is. Okay. I know what I was doing. I was in the wrong table. Sorry. Okay. So that's a Canadian story. And so there's Michele, my original user, and then this is the user that I just managed to create. Okay. You can clap if you like. It was just one really, I mean, really, you don't have to. That was nothing, please. Okay. So I've got this workflow that I've built. Instead of showing, obviously, instead of going through a complicated sample, this is actually specifically showing all the messages, of course. So I'm going to just have a verification token that we're going to say I got, and that would be the email that I got. And so I go to some site, and it's some page on the site with the link, and it's going to validate my email because I obviously received it. And then I'm going to go ahead and try and log in, and that's great. And then I'm going to log out. I'm going to log in again, and then at some point I'm going to go in here and say, hey, let's have about 4 failed login attempts, which will be the limit, and that's going to lock out my account. And then as a result, I need to unlock the account, which is usually timer-based. That's something we would typically implement, but you can also explicitly unlock a user from the admin. And then maybe I'm going to go and reset my password, and then I'm going to log in again, and here we go, right? So I did a bunch of things, and if I kind of head over to my my running, all these messages are being received by my consumer. So what it's actually doing is it's producing from the messages a state. And the state is the current state of my user table. So everything's recorded in messages, but what I'm actually doing is producing my table, right? So now I don't have the history if I do that, right? So what's all this stuff about having an automatic history? Well, I still have the messages. So the idea is I would keep those messages literally forever. Maybe there's an archive process at some point to cheap storage, but I can keep, say, a year of audit available and then back up everything else literally forever. And then if I ever need to reproduce that state, I can go back and replay the messages to produce it again. For example, we have a bug in our code, we forgot to write a certain calculated value, we need to recalculate the way we have the value. So we're going to go back to the messages, process it through the updated, better code, and have a new state and snapshot that if we like. So the idea is I'm working on a current state instead of having the messages be my state, which would be more like event sourcing. So with event sourcing, the idea would be the messages, the events are my actual database, right? Those are my state. Those are my system of record, which means every time I want to do some sort of query or report or gather information or even update a record and know that I can update it, I would be hitting the message store, and that would require me to use a tool, something like EventStore, which I'll show in a couple minutes. So without EventStore, just thinking about a messaging system, message streaming, I'm looking at keeping the messages forever so I could do event sourcing, but maybe this is a baby step towards it so that I get my audit, I have my history, I might not even have the time to build the history projections yet. So maybe I wait and I don't do that right away, but because I'm keeping the message, I could rebuild that at the time that I'm ready. And in the meantime, I have my current state store, and I have a way to go back and fix things. So what did I build is over here, right? So if I come back and refresh on my management and select this user, all this is showing is that I had 4 unsuccessful login attempts. And then when I was unlocked, my code was, probably buggy and forgot to update me and say, you're not locked out anymore. So it still says I have unsuccessful attempts. So at least that proves I did edit the record. So I clearly left that there on purpose. Okay. So what about history, though? I don't have a history right now. So we need to take care of that. And I have all these messages sitting in the in Kafka, which I could archive. But right now, I'm just going to, keep it running, obviously, locally. And if I was doing this in production, I would probably keep maybe for 7 days, the messages that are running through the system. And I would mirror or something to archive forever the rest of it. And I'd probably want to offload that to cheap storage at some point because it's going to get difficult to manage at some point, right? So that's the idea. But there are tools for that, so that's all good. It gives me the backup. It gives me the ability whenever I'm ready or need it to rebuild, right? In the meantime, I have my 80-20 rule. I have my current state. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is go back to this code here, and let's go into the solution, and let's go into the history consumer. So I have another consumer in here, and what this guy does is I'm just going to kind of float down a little bit here, has a message processor. He's going to listen on the same topic as the other consumer was. And so since he doesn't yet have a cursor, into the topic, it hasn't received any of the messages. It'll start right from the beginning and start building me a history table. So as soon as I turn this guy on, when he gathers it, he's going to create a record in the history store instead. And then, of course, his cursor will be maintained. If I shut him down, bring him back up again another time, he'll do it again. So I'll go ahead and start this guy, and we'll go to debug. I guess I can just do that. And so this is started, receiving the messages, you notice. Go, go, go. I don't know how many there were, maybe 7, 8, 9, something like that. And I'll head over to the docdb, and that has nothing to do with this table, but it has everything to do with the history table. Now, I'm not going to really be able to read this very well, so I'm going to go over here to the Query Explorer, and we'll grab the history table, which we have, and first I'll just run it this way, so we can scroll down. So we've got the Michele Busta history. We've got Michele LaRue. So you see a bunch of entries for me, the new user that I was running with, and that history has different types of messages. But it's a bit hard to read right now, so I'm going to go ahead and make a change. So let's go ahead and say I want to see c._ message type with a capital T probably, and we'll go ahead and run that again. And now you can see message type, user created, logged in, failed, locked out, etc. So I can now build that full history, and I can do reports on that. I can see exactly what happened with user ID 1, 2, 3, whoever, and gather, that at any time. I can also do interesting heuristics around how often people are, failing their login, how many retries it is typically. All that data is available, which I can repurpose in different ways by having other consumers or stream analytics on that same set of messages coming out of the message broker. Any questions so far? No, because it all makes sense, doesn't it? We're ready to do this. Okay. Yes. So I'm completely sold on at least attempting to fit this into the important parts of somebody's business model, if for no other reason than because the history, the audit, and the ability to do different views on the same data because of the messages being available and, archived. It's just too awesome for words. I know. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop this. I clearly amuse myself, and maybe that's what counts sometimes. And I, really used to be a comedian too, perhaps. So Let's go ahead and take a look at EventStore. So I'm going to run this a different way. So I have just a simple example with similar messages. And what I'm going to do is actually just run it first. So let's do that. I can probably just go, oh, you know what? I might want to actually start EventStore first. It kind of has to be running, just to point that out. So here's what we'll do. We'll do a stop Kafka, because that guy's finished. And that should do it. Okay, oops. Always think I'm on the other type of command line. And then here is my EventStore. So I guess I can just give this a run. So this is just running a local copy of it right now. So I have customers right now that are using Kafka the way I just showed you, right? Like, so that's their message broker technology of choice, running in DCOS or running in its own cluster. Doesn't, you know, it can be done both ways. And then I have customers that are using this in a multi-regional way. So there's another very viable option, except that this takes you the full distance. So where Kafka, you could decide to maybe project current state, do the 80-20 rule. It's comfortable, we understand it. I can keep my microservices, they fit in my head. This is the data I'm working with. These are the messages that fit that data. It's manageable. If I need to evolve the messages, it's all part of the same microservice. That message will never be used again in another microservice. The names are unique. The names have sources, where they come from, which microservice they're part of, and it's manageable because you're not going to have 10,000 message types in a single microservice. So you can evolve your data models, your schema, and your messages together in one unit. And then we go to another microservice and do the same and repeat. So you do the first one, and you do all the hard work of setting this up, and you do the 80-20 rule, where you've got a projection of the current state. And then as a migration step, start looking at projections that do, say, the history projection and make it possible to do querying and so on. And then eventually you could consider dynamically engaging the events to create the current state on the fly. That's like super advanced, right? So people who do that with Kafka have to write a bunch of Java code. And, you know, that's maybe not always desirable. Not because of Java necessarily, although that could be a thing too. But because, you know, it's a lot of work, right? It's not built in. So do the baby step, and this is a good story. And it doesn't have to be Kafka. It can be Event Hub if you're in Azure. It can be Kinesis if you're in Amazon. And, you know, you could argue that there are a number of other potentials, right? Those are maybe my first choices, if depending platform, okay? And if I'm in the cloud, it's actually nice if you can use a Kinesis or Event Hub, because then you have a software as a service, and you don't actually have to manage the cluster. You just have all that data. The difference is, you remember, you can't store it forever in those systems. You can store them for 30 days. You're going to still need an archive route. That's all you have to do, right? And then later, you'll write code to replay those messages. So that's not hard stuff, right? So you can do it, you know, do the archiving and then do the rest of it later. So when we come into EventStore, it's more pushing you all the way so that your actual storage, you no longer have the DocDB projection, you no longer have these other storage locations. You know, you've got EventStore, and that's your cluster, and that's got topics and separation partitions, if you will, right? So coming back to that, now that I have EventStore running, I can go back to my sample and give it a run. So here is the console, the mother of all consoles, that is thinking, because it's connecting to the service. And I don't think I have a breakpoint, so we're just going to be patient for a moment. I think it's coming to life now. Yes? Yes.
I don't think it's actually running.
No?
No. In the background. The service.
Oh. Oh, you mean I didn't run EventStore? Maybe not. Didn't I? Oh, you're right. Pair programming. I wanted to prove that somebody in the room had a heart, and it worked. Look at how good you feel right now. Let's give him a hand. Okay. So as I was saying, I'm going to run that again, because it's probably just hanging there, wondering what's going on, waiting for an act of kindness. Okay. Oh, that's a different problem. Yeah, I know what that is. Okay. It kind of partially ran is a problem. And it's sort of been designed to like run once, if you know what I mean. So, like all production code, really? Yeah, I amuse myself. Okay, so let's just restart that little guy. And we'll come over here. And, oh, I know what else I'm going to do. Excuse me while I load up localhost. Okay. I don't know what that is. Oh, are you kidding me? That's hilarious. How intrusive, though. I've never seen that before. Really? Oh, actually, sorry, I planned that. I'm so funny. Okay. So, yeah. So the stream, like I said, hey, focus, people. There's really important stuff to do here. So we're going to go over here, and I'm going to give this a run now. Okay. Okay, see? This is what I'm talking about, things that work. So I'm signed in. This is sort of choreographing a series of things on purpose, right? So I'm going to act like I signed in, and it's going to obviously write an event that I signed in, past tense. And I'm going to fail sign in, and oops. After I failed sign in, it actually went ahead and did a validate 3 times, which we didn't see, but we're going to go look at. And then after that happens, it will actually fix me and put me back online. So basically, it'll do a timeout, and after some time passes, it'll go ahead and unlock the user. So let's go see what it did. Here is my stream that was just created. And so you can see the history then of the events that are right here. Of course, I'm not coming in here to look at my data, right? Like this is just a tool, like administrative tool for EventStore. But the idea is that this is now my system of record. I have access to all the messages that played. I can see the contents of the message. The messages only contain what they need for their domain, right? And for their actual target. So some of them are really just sign in succeeded and here is the time. Right? There's nothing else. Of course, there's probably going to be other data, but you get the idea. So I can take a look at each of the messages. I can also, excuse me, go back here and take a look at things like how often did sign in failed happen, for example, for this user or for all the users, that kind of thing. So I can take any of the data that's being stored here, and I can also build projections. And again, looking at the history of the stream, this is the stream that I just created. This is now my system of record. The messages are past tense, just like you would do with event sourcing. But even when I do message-based systems that are not yet going to be used as event sourcing, I try to do the past tense rather than the command version, because I like it that the message means something happened, and I like it that that payload is significant enough to represent the state of my data. And I'm still going to play that to my current state. I'm going to operate off that. In this case, I'm going to operate off EventStore, which means I need a repository client that I can use to interact with it, right? So if we come in here, you know, there's a couple of things going on, right? I've got a description for each event, sign in failed, sign in succeeded. Each of these inherit the base class event. Each of those events, when they're played, let's come back over, are basically you know, written through the repository. So somewhere in here, I can go to the password user repository, and it'll get its EventStore connection, and it'll write those events, right? So it'll create the events that it needs to as things happen. So for example, somewhere in here, I've got register user. Let me see if I can find that under load, right? So register, 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 getting in there. Create an instance of a password user, for example. So that's going to be a password user created event. There's going to be the lockout. So somewhere in here, let's see. Okay, load. Here's my password user repository that's got all of the different capabilities. So saving the data is just implemented. It's part of the repository pattern, right? So that's implemented. So I got my store connection, and I'm going to load the data. And then somewhere in here, I know I have my lockout, but I'm not really seeing it. So, right. Let's see if I can go down here. So append is what's adding to the log. So this is basically appending the actual messages. So this is my password user registered. Somewhere down here, I've got a sign-in. So this will create a sign-in, and we'll see an append on that. Append sign-in succeeded, append sign-in failed, that kind of thing. So these are just, again, it's the syntax that's used for the event store implementation. But the idea is I'm going to have to define a bunch of events. Where do I put those? All in one file, of course, please. These are all in one file. That's exactly how I would do that. Not really, though. No, you're going to have a library of events as part of the microservice solution. You're going to have a library of models and services that are for the front end of the APIs that do work. You're going to have the services that are part of the microservice, but that one solution should represent the thing that is the unit of deployment, that is the unit of the business context, that is the thing that deploys always together. And those messages and models don't ever appear anywhere else. They're not shared, right? And so what do we do about shared code in that case? Like common authorization code against services or REST-based models, those things can't be in the solution. They have to be NuGet packages that I opt in to update so that when that's versioned, it doesn't impact all the microservices running in my system. It impacts the ones that chose to update, right? And if it's a mandatory update, then that's a thing that you're doing, right? So of course those things are going to happen. So 2 models, examples, building a microservice, having all in one place, not one file, but one solution. The idea of all of the messages that can happen, all of the payloads that can happen. One way, you're storing it actually with the target system. Another way, you're actually building it. Wait, am I in the right space? Where do I want to be? Hello. Oh, that's where I want to be. Yeah, so the other way, you're actually storing the messages, and that is your system of record, which means I have to learn how to work with that. So my customer that before I became there working with them, they had already chosen to go with EventStore. So they already have this multi-regional deployment. All we're doing is converting identity server to work with it. But I guess my point is, they chose that for a reason because they were fully bought in that for the size of their system that's deployed in Amazon, they needed to have that visibility, and they wanted to do the true event sourcing path out of the gate, and they felt like that was a good fit for them. But they have the engineers to manage it. And I get other people that are sort of timid and new to microservices, and they're saying, you know what, that's way too much for me. Let's just take that baby step. I hope that that makes sense. Those are the 2 sort of things. So I would summarize to say this. A message-based solution really, really thoughtfully helps you with the audit trail, helps you with history, helps you with being able to have new views into the data, giving you that tracking and activity workflow. So we have full visibility into everything. You tie that to your logging story to where you actually have also your whole system rigged for activity tracing through, plus the messages that happen. I've built Kibana dashboards with our team whereby we've had really rich interfaces, being able to click from a message to a full stack trace of everything from UI to the back. And that's really powerful. So your logging story can actually stitch with your messaging story. But the messages give you the data, and now the business. When I told some of these guys who invested in a POC recently that we were going to be holding on to these messages forever, and you could actually build new views into the data, I mean, they were literally drooling. It was almost rude. And so, I mean, it's for the business. That's why you do it. So I encourage you to think about it. Combine that with your centralized logs, which can produce monitoring. You can have monitoring on the messages too, right? Because those could be, why is so many users having reset password, that kind of thing. So auditing on certain types of behavior for security audit as well. And then, of course, remember that those magical tools and ESBs, although they might provide some features, you might lose some control, and you're always going to have to build custom business tooling on top of that. In other words, no pain, no gain. Thank you very much. Thanks. That's what I mean. Yeah. Thanks. I almost never finish early. Am I early? I'm 3 minutes early. What's wrong with me today? Wow. Thanks for coming. See you later today, I guess. So, yeah.